Picture this: a handful of determined fighters standing on a hillside, watching as the dust rises from an approaching army 10 times their size. The odds are impossible. The outcome seems certain, and yet, against all logic, history tells us these smaller forces didn't just survive, they won. How? Not by brute strength, not by overwhelming numbers, but by something far more powerful: sheer ingenuity. Across the battlefields of the medieval world, outnumbered commanders turned to strategies so clever, so unexpected, that they've become almost mythical in their brilliance. But here's the thing: these weren't just flukes or lucky breaks. They were calculated, deliberate, and often breathtakingly simple tactics designed to exploit every weakness of a larger, slower enemy. And today, we're going to uncover 28 of these forgotten strategies, each one a masterclass in how to outthink your opponent when the stakes are life and death. Think about the last time you faced a challenge that felt insurmountable. Maybe it was a personal goal, a professional hurdle, or even just a day where everything seemed stacked against you. Now imagine that same feeling, but with swords, shields, and the fate of kingdoms hanging in the balance. That's the world these warriors lived in. And what's truly remarkable isn't just that they found ways to win, it's how they did it. Some used the land itself as a weapon, turning forests, rivers, and even the weather into allies. Others played mind games so effective they could make an entire army retreat without swinging a single blade. These weren't just tricks, they were revolutions in strategy, proof that the best weapon isn't always the biggest or the sharpest, it's the one your enemy never sees coming. So why do these ancient tactics matter now? Because the lessons they teach go far beyond medieval battlefields. They're about resourcefulness, about seeing opportunities where others see only obstacles. They remind us that preparation and creativity can level any playing field, whether you're facing a corporate giant, a personal setback, or just the daily grind. And perhaps most importantly, they're stories of hope, proof that size and strength don't always dictate the outcome. Over the next few minutes, we'll step into the shoes of these underdog commanders, peeling back the layers of history to reveal the cunning, the audacity, and the sheer brilliance that changed the course of wars. Get ready to discover how the smallest armies in history outsmarted their invaders, and how their forgotten strategies might just inspire you to tackle your own battles, no sword required. To truly grasp how these smaller armies defied the odds, we need to step onto the medieval battlefield, not as we imagine it from movies, but as it really was. Picture uneven ground riddled with hidden ditches, dense forests where visibility vanished after 20 paces, narrow mountain passes that funneled thousands into helpless bottlenecks. This wasn't a chessboard with neat squares. It was a chaotic, living landscape where every hill and stream could become a weapon. Larger armies relied on sheer mass, moving like slow giants across open plains. But smaller forces, they saw the land differently. A marsh wasn't an obstacle, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. A rocky outcrop wasn't just scenery, it was a fortress. And then there were the invisible factors, the ones no ledger of troop numbers could capture. Morale was everything. A hungry, homesick army, no matter its size, could crumble at the first sign of trouble. Smaller forces exploited this ruthlessly. They'd vanish into the countryside, letting supply lines stretch thin, then strike at the moment when frustration peaked. They understood something their enemies often forgot. Battles weren't just won with steel, but with psychology. A well-timed rumor about poisoned wells, a sudden ambush under cover of fog. These weren't just tactics. They were masterclasses in breaking an opponent's will before the first real clash. Logistics were the silent Achilles heel of every large army. Moving thousands of men required wagons of grain, herds of livestock, and clean water sources, all of which became liabilities in the hands of clever defenders. Ever heard of the scorched earth strategy? Villagers would burn their own crops, poison their own wells, forcing invaders to carry every ounce of supplies across miles of hostile territory. Meanwhile, the smaller force, living off local knowledge and hidden caches, could strike at will. This was warfare stripped down to its essence, not who had the most soldiers, but who could outlast, outthink, and outmaneuver. The medieval period wasn't just an age of swords and castles. It was a laboratory of human ingenuity, where constraints sparked innovation. Every strategy we're about to explore grew from this reality. That victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. And that's where the real lessons begin. Imagine the sheer nerve it took, a band of warriors turning their backs on the enemy, seemingly fleeing in panic, while secretly knowing this was the moment their opponents took the bait. The Feigned Retreat wasn't just a trick. It was psychological warfare at its finest, a carefully choreographed dance of deception that played on one of humanity's oldest instincts, the urge to chase a retreating foe. The Mongols didn't just use this tactic, they elevated it to an art form. Picture their horse archers, masters of mobility, suddenly wheeling away in apparent disarray, luring overconfident knights or infantry into pursuit. The enemy, sensing victory, would break formation, surging forward only to find themselves funneled into a killing zone where hidden forces waited. What made this so devastating wasn't just the ambush itself, but the precision behind it. Timing was everything. A retreat too slow and the enemy might suspect the ruse; too fast and they'd lose contact entirely. The Mongols trained relentlessly for this, using flag signals and drumbeats to coordinate their route with eerie synchronicity. And here's where their genius truly shone. They understood human nature. Pride often blinded larger armies to the danger. After days of chasing an apparently broken foe, exhaustion and overconfidence set in. That's when the trap snapped shut. But the Mongols weren't the only ones to wield this strategy with brutal efficiency. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror's forces pretended to flee not once, but twice, shattering the English shield wall each time as overeager defenders broke ranks. The key to success: discipline. For every soldier playing the terrified fugitive, there had to be absolute trust that their comrades would turn at the exact right moment. One misstep, one moment of genuine panic, and the entire maneuver could collapse into catastrophe. This tactic reveals a universal truth about asymmetric warfare. The underdog's greatest weapon is often the enemy's own assumptions. Larger armies expected smaller forces to flee or fight head-on, never to use their own retreat as a lure, and that's what made the Feigned Retreat so lethal. It wasn't just about physical positioning, it was about rewriting the rules of engagement in real time, turning the invaders' momentum against them. Even today, the lesson echoes far beyond battlefields. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't standing your ground, it's knowing exactly when to step back and what to do next. Dense forests became the great equalizer on medieval battlefields, nature's own fortress where a handful of skilled fighters could hold off an army. Unlike open plains where numbers and heavy cavalry dominated, tangled undergrowth and towering trees turned every shadow into a potential ambush. The Welsh longbowmen mastered this art, their arrows slicing through gaps in armor before they melted back into the foliage, leaving invaders stumbling blindly into a green labyrinth of death. What made forests so devastatingly effective? First, they shattered the hierarchy of traditional warfare. A knight's expensive armor meant nothing when low branches knocked him from his horse, or when narrow trails forced his formation into disarray. Meanwhile, lightly armed locals moved like ghosts along game trails they'd known since childhood, striking where least expected. The English learned this the hard way during campaigns in Wales, where entire columns would emerge from the woods bristling with arrows like pincushions, their attackers already vanished. But guerrilla warfare in forests wasn't just about arrows. It was a symphony of psychological torment. Invaders would hear distant horns echoing through the trees, signaling invisible watchers tracking their every move. Supplies went missing, scouts never returned. The forest itself seemed alive, hostile, as if the very branches conspired against them. Morale crumbled faster than battle lines. This strategy demanded more than just terrain. It required intimate knowledge of every route and ravine. Scottish Highlanders used moss patterns on trees to navigate trackless glens, while Baltic tribes built camouflaged pit traps along game trails. The key was asymmetry, never fighting fair. A large army's strength became its weakness once trees broke its cohesion, leaving isolated pockets ripe for annihilation. Perhaps the greatest testament to this tactic's success, how desperately invaders tried to counter it. Some armies brought teams of woodcutters to clear paths, only to find felled trees now formed new barriers. Others burned sections of forest, but smoke blinded them while defenders simply retreated deeper. In the end, the lesson was clear: when outnumbered, let the land fight for you. A single archer in the right tree could achieve what 100 soldiers in open combat might not control without confrontation. Nothing demoralized an invading army faster than watching their own bodies betray them, not from sword wounds or arrow strikes, but from something as simple as a sip of water or a bite of bread. Poisoning supplies wasn't about dramatic clashes on the battlefield. It was a slow, insidious war of attrition that played out in campfires and watering holes. Picture a medieval army marching deep into enemy territory, their supply wagons dwindling, forced to scavenge from abandoned villages. What they didn't know: the grain stores had been laced with ergot, a fungus causing hallucinations and agonizing cramps. The wells tainted with animal carcasses or toxic plants. Within days, soldiers who should have been storming castle gates were doubled over in pain, their strength leaching away with every contaminated meal. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its deniability. Unlike an ambush that left clear evidence, poisoned supplies could be dismissed as bad luck, spoiled food, dysentery, or just the hazards of campaign life. Byzantine commanders were masters of this shadow warfare, often leaving behind abandoned wine barrels spiked with laxatives or hallucinogens. The invading force, parched and celebratory after a long march, would drink deeply only to spend the next week incapacitated. Meanwhile, the defenders gained precious time to reinforce their positions or launch counterattacks against a now weakened foe. But the psychological impact cut even deeper. Imagine the paranoia that set in when soldiers couldn't trust the bread they baked or the streams they'd drunk from for days. Some armies resorted to absurd precautions, testing food on prisoners or livestock, boiling every drop of water, which slowed their advance to a crawl. The Mongols faced this during their invasion of Khwarezmia, where defenders poisoned entire oases, forcing Genghis Khan's troops to carry water in sealed skins for weeks. This tactic also exposed a grim truth about medieval logistics. No army could carry enough provisions for long campaigns. They had to live off the land, and that dependence became their vulnerability. Scottish clans during the Wars of Independence would salt their own fields with quicklime rather than let English troops harvest them, turning abundance into scarcity. The message was clear: every step deeper into hostile territory carried invisible risks. What's fascinating is how modern this ancient strategy feels. Even today, disrupting supply chains remains a cornerstone of asymmetric warfare. The medieval version simply used nature's chemistry instead of cyber attacks or sanctions. It proved that sometimes the deadliest weapons weren't swords or siege engines, they were the basics of survival, turned against those who took them for granted. Darkness was more than just the absence of light, it was a weapon, a cloak that could turn a handful of determined fighters into an invisible nightmare for an unprepared army. Picture an enemy camp at midnight, soldiers huddled around dying fires, their senses dulled by exhaustion. Suddenly, shadows come alive, the clash of steel, the screams of startled men, torches extinguished as quickly as they're lit, and then silence, leaving behind only chaos and the creeping dread of not knowing where or when the next strike would come. This was the terror of the night raid, where a small force could paralyze an entire army without ever fighting a conventional battle. The Swiss perfected this tactic during their wars of independence, their alpine fighters moving like specters through the blackness. Unlike daytime battles where formations and numbers mattered, night stripped away every advantage of size. A charging knight was useless if he couldn't see his attacker. Archers couldn't loose volleys into the void. Commanders shouted orders no one could follow, while the raiders, knowing the terrain, intimately struck supply wagons, stole weapons, and vanished before any organized response could form. The goal wasn't always to kill, but to erode. A single raid might leave an army sleepless for nights, their frayed nerves making them prone to mistakes when true battle came. Timing was everything. The deepest hours of night, when sentries fought drowsiness, were ideal. The Swiss often struck just before dawn, exploiting the moment when night's grip was strongest but exhaustion ran deepest. They'd infiltrate camps not through brute force, but by mimicking the rhythms of the enemy, whispering passwords they'd overheard, wearing captured cloaks, blending into the confusion they created. One account describes a raid where fighters slipped into an Austrian camp, cut tent ropes so collapsing canvas disoriented soldiers, then disappeared with sacks of grain while their enemies flailed at phantoms. But the true mastery lay in the aftermath. A night raid's psychological toll far outweighed its physical damage. Soldiers who'd survived would jump at every rustle, distrust shadows, question their own comrades. The Scottish Highlanders played on this fear during raids against English forces, sometimes leaving eerie tokens, a single playing card, a tuft of fur, to stoke superstitious dread. An army that couldn't rest was already half defeated, its morale crumbling faster than its battle lines. What's remarkable is how adaptable this strategy proved across cultures. The Maori in New Zealand used stealthy night assaults called Wakakakoti to overwhelm British forces during the Musket Wars, while the Vietnamese layered traps with nighttime harassment against larger invaders centuries later. The principles remained universal. Darkness was the great equalizer, fear the ultimate force multiplier. Night raids reveal a brutal truth about warfare. Control isn't just about territory, but perception. A small force could dominate the hours between sunset and sunrise, turning time itself into a weapon. And in that darkness, the balance of power shifted to those who dared to move unseen, proving once again that victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to those who best understood the art of misdirection. The most powerful weapon in medieval warfare wasn't always steel, it was information. And nothing leveled the playing field faster than feeding an enemy precisely the wrong intelligence at the right moment. Imagine a Byzantine general seated in Constantinople's war rooms, carefully crafting letters that overstated his garrison's starvation or undercounted his cavalry. These documents would accidentally fall into enemy hands through bribed messengers or drunken scouts. Within days, opposing commanders would adjust their entire strategy based on lies, marching into ambushes or diverting troops to non-existent threats. The Byzantines didn't just fight their enemies, they scripted their enemies' mistakes. This art of controlled deception went far beyond simple trickery. It required an intricate understanding of human psychology, what an invader would believe, what they desperately hoped was true. During the Arab-Byzantine Wars, Emperor Heraclius once spread rumors that his army was decimated by plague, even staging funeral pyres visible from enemy camps. The ruse worked so well that when his fully healthy forces launched a surprise attack at dawn, the stunned invaders thought ghosts had risen against them. But false intelligence wasn't just about written words. The Byzantines weaponized every possible channel. They'd send deserters to enemy camps with tales of crumbling morale, only for these traitors to slip back at night with vital reconnaissance. They staged fake arguments between officers where loudly leaked battle plans were pure fiction. Even the architecture of their cities played a role. Constantinople's massive land walls hid a cruel surprise for attackers who'd been told the seaward defenses were weaker. The brilliance lay in plausibility. A lie too extravagant would raise suspicion, so Byzantine disinformation often contained kernels of truth. If their cavalry was strong, they'd admit it, but claim the horses were ill, making the strength irrelevant. This layered deception kept invaders second-guessing every scrap of intelligence. After a while, even genuine reports were dismissed as more Byzantine tricks, paralyzing enemy decision-making. Smaller forces across Europe adopted these tactics with brutal creativity. During the Reconquista, Spanish defenders let Muslim armies capture maps showing imaginary mountain passes that led to deadly box canyons. In the Baltic, Teutonic knights received forged letters from allies urging night attacks, only to find Lithuanian ambushes waiting where the letters promised undefended camps. The lesson transcends medieval battlefields. In an age where information moves at the speed of light, false intelligence remains a cornerstone of asymmetric warfare. Those Byzantine generals would have recognized the modern tactics of leaking fake satellite images or doctored communications, because when you can't outmuscle your opponent, the next best option is to outthink them by letting their own assumptions do the work for you. There's a grim elegance to the scorched earth strategy, a deliberate act of destruction so total, so merciless, that it turns survival itself into a weapon. Picture a medieval countryside not as lush farmland, but as a smoking wasteland, every grain store torched, every well filled with rubble and salt. Villagers who'd spent generations tending these lands now watched as their own hands lit the fires that would starve an invading army. This wasn't just sabotage, it was a calculated gamble that the enemy's hunger would outpace their resolve. The Mongols learned this the hard way during their invasion of Kievan Rus in the 13th century. As their horse-mounted warriors pushed deeper into Russian territory, they found villages eerily empty but not abandoned. The food stores were ashes. The wells reeked of rotting carcasses. Even the bridges across rivers had been reduced to charred timbers. The Russian defenders, led by princes like Dmitry Donskoy, understood something critical. The Mongols' strength lay in their speed, their ability to live off the land as they conquered. By denying them that, the Russians turned the vast steppe into a trap. Every mile forward meant another mile from resupply, another day of weakened horses and hollow stomachs. But scorched earth wasn't just about burning crops, it was about controlling time. Large armies moved like ponderous beasts, consuming everything in their path. Remove that path, and suddenly their momentum became their downfall. The Spanish encountered this during their campaigns against the Aztecs, who shattered their own aqueducts rather than let invaders drink. In Scotland, William Wallace's forces salted fields and drove livestock into hidden glens, leaving English troops to march through a man-made desert. The message was clear: you may take this land, but you won't survive it. the psychological toll was even more devastating than the physical deprivation. Soldiers who'd expected to feast on captured granaries instead faced empty silos and the creeping realization that every step forward deepened their peril. Morale crumbled faster than supplies. During the 100 Years' War, French peasants adopted a brutal variation, booby-trapping seemingly abandoned food with ground glass or animal poison, turning desperation into a death sentence for scavenging soldiers. What's often overlooked is the staggering discipline this strategy demanded. To destroy your own resources required leaders willing to make unbearable choices and populations united enough to endure the sacrifice. The Russians didn't just burn their outskirts, they torched Moscow itself in 1812 rather than let Napoleon's Grand Army winter there. That single act, immortalized as the Fire of Moscow, doomed the French retreat, transforming it into a frozen nightmare. Scorched Earth reveals warfare's darkest truth. Sometimes victory isn't about what you can take, but what you're willing to lose. It's a reminder that land alone doesn't sustain an army, logistics do. And in the hands of defenders with nothing left to lose, even barren Earth could become the deadliest ally of all. Some of history's most effective weapons made no sound when drawn and left no visible wounds because they targeted the mind itself. Imagine being a soldier in an enemy camp when the night air suddenly fills with unearthly howls, not from wolves but from human throats. The Norse didn't just announce their attacks, they orchestrated them like horror plays, using fear as their opening volley. This wasn't mere intimidation. It was precision-engineered psychological warfare designed to trigger primal instincts before a single arrow flew. The brilliance of these tactics lay in their simplicity. Armies could withstand steel, but dread that spread like wildfire. Celtic warriors painted their bodies blue and charged naked into battle, not just for protection against evil spirits, as some believed, but because the sight paralyzed opponents with sheer disbelief. The Tartars went further, tying branches to their horses' tails to raise unnatural dust clouds, making 500 riders look like 5,000. And in the misty highlands, Scottish clansmen would dip their spears in peat bogs before battle, letting the rust-streaked weapons glint like blood-stained teeth in the sunlight, a visual omen of what awaited their enemies. Sound became its own arsenal. The Swiss Alpine fighters perfected the Kurehen, a haunting melody played on giant cow horns that echoed through mountain passes, disorienting invaders who couldn't tell if the notes came from ahead or behind. The Aztecs used conch shells to mimic jaguar roars, turning familiar jungle sounds into omens of death. But perhaps the most chilling example came from the Mamluks, who would secretly infiltrate enemy camps before dawn to whisper prayers or children's names, personalized terror that made soldiers question whether the voices were real or spectral. Staged supernatural events took this manipulation to another level. During the Baltic Crusades, Lithuanian defenders lit floating lanterns along rivers at night, convincing Teutonic knights they were seeing the souls of the damned. In Wales, rebels tied glowing fungus to sheep, creating ghostly herds that led patrols into bogs. The goal was never to kill outright, but to corrode morale, to make the enemy's imagination their worst foe. What made these strategies so devastating was their ripple effect. Fear didn't just unsettle individuals, it shattered unit cohesion. A single soldier bolting in panic could trigger a rout, as seen when Hungarian forces fled from what they swore were vampire-like shapely warriors with filed teeth. Commanders knew this well. Genghis Khan's scouts spread exaggerated tales of Mongol brutality so effectively that some cities surrendered at the mere sight of his horsemen on the horizon. The lesson transcends time. In any conflict, the battlefield isn't just physical. It's the space between your enemy's ears, and sometimes the most decisive victories come not from breaking bones but from bending minds. The genius of a choke point wasn't in its size, it was in how it rendered size irrelevant. Picture a mountain pass so narrow that only 3 men could walk abreast, its walls rising like stone giants on either side. Now imagine an army of thousands, their banners fluttering, their commanders fuming as this unstoppable force becomes stoppable. The Swiss didn't just defend these passages, they weaponized geography itself, turning the Alps into a labyrinth where invaders marched single file into slaughter. At Morgarten Pass in 1315, a handful of Confederates waited atop steep slopes as 20,000 Habsburg soldiers trudged below. When the signal came, they sent avalanches of boulders crashing down, then descended with halberds, long poles with axe blades turning the narrow trail into a meat grinder. By day's end, the pass ran red with the blood of men who never even saw their killers. What made these choke points so devastating was physics disguised as strategy. A wide battlefield let large armies flank and surround, but in a gorge, front lines became death traps. Armor that deflected arrows became a liability when fighters were pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to raise swords in the crush. The Swiss exploited this with brutal efficiency, using pikes to push forward while halberdiers hooked knights from their saddles. At the St. Gotthard Pass, they dug hidden pits lined with spikes, covered them with leaves, and watched as charging cavalry vanished into the earth. But the true mastery lay in preparation. These weren't last-minute ambushes, they were years in the making. The Swiss built collapsing rock slides triggered by ropes, positioned logs to roll downhill at precise moments, even diverted streams to flood passes at need. During the Burgundian Wars, they reinforced natural chokeholds with makeshift barriers, wagons lashed together, felled trees studded with iron spikes, forcing Charles the Bold's famed cavalry to dismount and crawl. The psychological toll was just as calculated. Imagine being a soldier entering a shadowed canyon, hearing rocks clatter above but seeing nothing, knowing death could come from any direction. The Welsh longbowmen at Agincourt had their arrows, but the Swiss had something worse: claustrophobia. By the time invaders emerged from these gauntlets, if they emerged, their will to fight often didn't. This strategy's legacy echoes beyond medieval Europe. The Afghan Mujahideen used mountain passes to cripple Soviet convoys, just as the Viet Cong funneled American patrols into bamboo thickets. The lesson remains universal. When you can't match your enemy's strength, change the battlefield until their strength becomes their weakness. And sometimes, all that takes is finding the right patch of ground where numbers stop mattering. Booby traps turned the very ground beneath an invader's feet into a silent conspirator. Imagine marching through what appears to be an ordinary forest, only for the earth to give way underfoot, plunging you into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. Or hearing a faint snap as a tripwire releases a weighted log swinging from the trees. These weren't just obstacles, they were psychological landmines, each one a reminder that every step forward could be the last. The medieval Vietnamese elevated this art during their resistance against Mongol invasions, transforming their jungles into lethal puzzles where nature itself became an active combatant. The effectiveness of booby traps lay in their unpredictability. Unlike a fortified wall or a manned barricade, these hidden dangers left no pattern to anticipate. The Welsh dug pits of despair, deep holes camouflaged with woven grass and leaves along known invasion routes, then watched as charging English cavalry vanished into the earth mid-gallop. In the Baltic forests, Teutonic knights stumbled upon wolf pits, their spiked bottoms concealed by layers of loose brush. But the real terror came from the traps that didn't kill outright. A maimed soldier screaming in agony did far more damage to morale than a corpse ever could, forcing entire columns to halt as comrades tried to extract him. Vietnamese guerrillas during the Mongol Wars took this further, engineering multi-layered death traps. Bamboo spikes coated in human waste lined camouflaged pits, ensuring even superficial wounds festered into deadly infections. They rigged riverbanks with underwater snares to drag swimmers under, and suspended rolling cages filled with rocks above narrow trails. When Kublai Khan's forces invaded in the 13th century, they faced an environment that seemed alive with malice, where vines might conceal strangling nooses, and harmless-looking footpaths triggered cascades of poisoned darts. The psychological toll was exponential. Soldiers began seeing threats where none existed, poking every bush with spears, flinching at bird calls. Commanders slowed advances to a crawl, wasting precious campaign time. And that was the trap's true purpose, not just to kill, but to distort time and space. A one-day march could stretch into a week of paranoid inchworm progress, draining supplies and fraying nerves. By the time the invaders reached their objective, they were already defeated not by battle, but by the cumulative weight of 1,000 unseen threats. What's fascinating is how these medieval tactics foreshadowed modern asymmetric warfare. The Viet Cong's punji sticks of the 20th century mirrored the Welsh spike pits, just as IEDs in contemporary conflicts echo the Byzantine faugas, stone jars filled with flammable powder and shrapnel buried along roadways. The principles remain unchanged. When you lack overwhelming force, make the terrain your ally. Turn the invaders' advance into a gauntlet where every footfall carries consequence, and watch as their numerical advantage dissolves into the earth itself. Nothing disorients an invading army faster than the creeping realization that everything they see is an illusion, that the enemy they're tracking doesn't actually exist. The art of the false camp turned deception into theater, with empty tents, smoldering fires, and straw-stuffed dummies standing sentry under moonlight. The Ottomans wielded this tactic with chilling precision during their clashes with Crusader forces, leaving behind entire villages of ghosts. Picture a scouting party cresting a hill at dawn, spotting what appears to be a bustling military encampment, smoke rising from cook fires, shadows moving behind canvas, the distant clang of blacksmiths. By the time they realize the soldiers are logs draped in cloaks and their activity is just wind-rattling pots, the real Ottoman army has already circled behind them. What made these decoys so effective was their attention to detail. A poorly staged camp might use a few token tents, but masters of deception like Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt went further. They left half-eaten meals by fires kept burning with slow-release fuels, scattered footprints leading in conflicting directions, even penned livestock to complete the illusion of recent occupation. The goal wasn't just to confuse, it was to freeze an enemy in place while the real strike force maneuvered. During the Nicopolis campaign in 1396, Crusader knights wasted precious hours surrounding a false Ottoman camp, only to find themselves trapped when the actual army attacked from their undefended rear. But the psychological impact ran deeper than wasted time. Each empty camp eroded an invader's trust in their own intelligence. Scouts began doubting their eyes, commanders hesitating before acting on reconnaissance. The Mongols exploited this brilliantly during their westward expansion, leaving mock camps spaced a day's march apart, just close enough to suggest a retreating force, but always vanishing before contact. By the time opponents realized the pattern, their supplies were exhausted, chasing phantoms across the steppe. The Venetians added a sinister twist during their wars with Genoa, floating derelict ships rigged with timed flares. When Genoa's sailors boarded these abandoned vessels at night, the sudden eruptions not only caused panic but drew entire fleets toward the wrong coordinates. Similarly, Welsh rebels would leave dummy outposts near English garrisons, then ambush relief troops sent to investigate. False camps reveal a fundamental truth of warfare: perception dictates reality. When you control what your enemy believes they see, You control their movements, their decisions, even their fears. It's no coincidence that modern militaries still train in constructing dummy airfields and inflatable tanks. The medieval art of making something from nothing endures because it works. And in an era where drones and satellites have replaced scout horses, the principle remains unchanged. Sometimes the most powerful army is the one that isn't there at all. The hollow square wasn't just a formation, it was a fortress without walls, a living barricade of flesh and steel that turned every direction into a killing field. Picture a tight ring of Scottish spearmen, their pikes angled outward like the spines of a hedgehog, while inside the square, archers nocked arrows with cold precision. This was warfare reduced to brutal geometry. No flanks to turn, no weak points to exploit, just a perimeter of death waiting for cavalry to impale themselves upon it. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce's forces used this formation to devastating effect, transforming what should have been an English cavalry's triumphant charge into a slaughterhouse of tangled horses and screaming men. What made the hollow square so lethal was its elegant simplicity. Medieval battles often hinged on momentum, knights relying on the shock of their charge to break infantry lines. But the square removed that advantage entirely. Spears set at chest height created an impassable thicket, while archers inside the formation rained death over their comrades' heads. The English learned this the hard way when their armored destriers, bred for crushing charges, found themselves skewered on schiltron pikes. Wounded horses collapsed, throwing riders into the mud where Scottish claymores finished the work. But the true genius lay in the square's adaptability. Unlike static fortifications, this human fortress could pivot on command. Swiss mercenaries later perfected the technique, adding crossbowmen who could rotate firing lines as the square shifted to face new threats. At the Battle of Arbedo in 1422, a Swiss square weathered repeated Milanese cavalry assaults by slowly rotating like a grinding millstone, its edges constantly presenting fresh spears to exhausted attackers. The psychological impact was equally calculated. Charging knights expecting to scatter foot soldiers instead met an unyielding wall of spear points, a demoralizing sight that often broke their will before contact. Scottish chronicles describe English horses rearing in panic, their riders struggling to control mounts that instinctively recoiled from the bristling thicket. Meanwhile, the men inside the square drew strength from their unbroken formation, their chants and war cries amplifying as each failed charge proved their invulnerability. This tactic's brilliance extended beyond the battlefield. The hollow square became a masterclass in resource allocation, concentrating limited forces into an impervious shape that nullified the enemy's greatest strength. Welsh longbowmen adapted it during the Glyndŵr Rising, forming mobile squares that could advance while maintaining defensive integrity. Even the Romans had used a version called the orbis, proving that some solutions transcend eras. What's often overlooked is the discipline required to maintain the square under assault. One break in the line, one moment of hesitation, and the entire formation could collapse like a bursting dam. Training was relentless drilling until men could reform the square blindfolded, until their muscles remembered the angles of their pikes even amidst chaos. The Swiss reputedly practiced with live cavalry charges, their squares holding firm as tons of horseflesh thundered toward them before veering away at the last heartbeat. The hollow square's legacy endures in modern riot police formations and infantry tactics, a testament to its timeless logic. It proved that on the medieval battlefield, where brute force often decided victories, there still existed moments when intelligence and geometry could triumph over sheer power. A well-formed square wasn't just a defensive tool, it was a statement that sometimes the best way to withstand an unstoppable force isn't to meet it head-on, but to shape yourself into something it cannot break. Water could be just as treacherous as land when you knew where the hidden knives lay beneath the surface. Picture a Venetian galley, sleek and nimble, darting between islands as hulking enemy warships gave chase, only to hear the sickening crunch of oak planks grinding against submerged reefs. This wasn't just evasion, it was aquatic judo, using an opponent's own weight against them. The Venetians didn't fight the Adriatic's shallows, they weaponized them, turning geography into an extension of their fleet. The secret lay in local knowledge passed down through generations of fishermen and sailors. Where invaders saw only open water, Venetian captains memorized every sandbar, every shifting shoal. During the War of Chioggia in the late 14th century, they let Genoese galleons pursue them into the lagoons, maze-like channels, where the tides conspired with the defenders. Heavy ships that moments before had been symbols of naval supremacy now listed helplessly, their hulls speared by unseen obstacles. Meanwhile, Venetian light galleys, designed specifically for these waters, darted in to board stranded vessels or rake them with concentrated arrow fire. But the ambush was only half the strategy. Timing was everything. The Venetians mastered the art of tidal warfare, luring enemies into traps at high tide when reefs lay hidden, then attacking as the receding waters left their foes stranded like beached whales. In one legendary engagement, they used fire ships, old vessels packed with pitch and set ablaze, to herd an enemy fleet into a narrow strait where the combination of flames and unforgiving rocks created a maritime abattoir. Other cultures adapted this principle with brutal creativity. The Kievan Rus used river networks to ambush Byzantine fleets, hiding boats in tributaries until the moment they could swarm like waterborne wolves. The Chinese Admiral Zheng, he employed false retreats to lure pirate ships into pre-marked zones where submerged chains could tangle their rudders. Even the Vikings, despite their reputation for brute force, would sometimes feign distress near rocky coasts, drawing merchant ships into rescue attempts that ended with both vessels dashed against the cliffs. What made naval ambushes so psychologically devastating was the helplessness they inflicted. On land, a surrounded army could dig in or fight its way free. But a ship trapped in shallow waters had nowhere to run, no ground to hold. Crews that had laughed at their enemies' cowardice now watched in horror as the smaller fleet circled like sharks, picking them apart at leisure. The Venetians took grim satisfaction in recording how often stranded captains burned their own ships rather than let them be captured, a final act of defiance that only proved how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. This strategy's legacy ripples into modern naval warfare, from PT boats ambushing supply convoys in World War II to stealthy coastal defenses today. It's a reminder that control of the seas doesn't always belong to the biggest fleet, but to those who know the water's secrets and aren't afraid to use them. Animals became unexpected warriors in medieval warfare, not as mascots, but as weapons capable of unraveling disciplined formations with sheer terror. Imagine a swarm of enraged bees unleashed from clay pots hurled into enemy ranks, their stings finding every gap in armor. Or cattle set ablaze with pitch-soaked bundles tied to their tails, stampeding through campfires in a frenzy of smoke and hooves. These weren't acts of desperation, they were calculated tactics that turned livestock into agents of chaos. The Byzantines kept hives along their fortress walls, ready to tip them over onto scaling ladders, while Hungarian defenders drove spiked bulls into Teutonic knights' flanks, exploiting the animal's instinct to flee pain by directing it straight at their foes. But the true artistry lay in timing. A well-placed animal attack didn't just cause physical harm, it shattered morale at critical moments. During the Siege of Belgrade in 1456, Serbian forces catapulted beehives into Ottoman siege lines just as fatigue set in at dusk. Sleep-deprived soldiers already battling sweltering heat now faced clouds of venomous insects, their formations dissolving into panicked swats and collisions. Similarly, Welsh shepherds would sneak dogs with burning brands tied to their backs into English camps at night, the terrified animals zigzagging through tents to spread flames where buckets couldn't reach. Some cultures weaponized animals through training rather than terror. The Numidians' North African horsemen who fought alongside Carthage used attack dogs bred to leap at the throats of Roman legionnaires, their jaws clamping onto helmet straps to wrench heads backward. In the Baltic, Lithuanian tribes deployed hunting lynxes against Teutonic knights, their claws slipping between chainmail rings to shred the padded undergarments. Even small creatures played roles. Mongol scouts released eagles to disrupt carrier pigeons, grounding an enemy's communication network with nature's own aerial dominance. The psychological impact often outweighed the physical. Elephants might trample a dozen men, but the sight of them sent 100 more scrambling. At the Battle of Zoma, Hannibal's war elephants, some armored with tower howdahs, initially terrified Roman lines until they were lured into makeshift corridors where caltrops crippled their feet. The lesson wasn't lost on smaller armies. You didn't need your own elephants to exploit their shock value. Scottish clans herded deer toward English archers during moonless nights, the animals' silhouettes mimicking a surprise cavalry charge and provoking wasted volleys that left bowmen defenseless at dawn's real assault. Perhaps the most ingenious adaptations came from resourcefulness. When the Khmer Empire lacked war elephants, they trained water buffalo to charge with fire-hardened bamboo horns. Swiss alpine fighters used avalanches as natural cavalry, triggering them with horns to mimic the rumble of approaching hooves. Even insects became conscripts. Japanese ninja were rumored to release crickets in enemy camps, their chirps masking the sound of infiltrators' footsteps. Animal warfare reveals a profound truth about medieval ingenuity. Constraints bred creativity. Armies without siege engines or heavy cavalry found allies in the natural world, turning creatures' instincts against enemies who'd trained for steel, not talons. It was asymmetry at its most primal, proof that sometimes the fiercest weapon wasn't forged in a smithy, but born in a hive, a nest, or a pasture, and in that unpredictability lay its power. Because no drill manual could prepare a soldier for the moment when the battlefield itself seemed to turn against him, not with swords, but with wings, claws, and fangs. The deadliest warriors weren't always the loudest sometimes. They were the ones who made no sound at all. Picture a moonless night in feudal Japan, where a castle's sentries peer into the darkness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, unaware that shadowy figures are already scaling the walls with cloth-wrapped feet and breath held still. The ninja clans didn't just move quietly, they weaponized silence itself, turning absence into an advantage that could unravel entire armies. While samurai relished the clash of steel and war cries, these masters of stealth proved that the softest footsteps could strike harder than any battle drum. What set the silent march apart wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the discipline behind it. Ninja trained for years to control every rustle of fabric, every exhalation, even the way their tools were wrapped to prevent metallic clicks. Straw sandals replaced iron-shod boots, armor was swapped for padded cloth, and weapons were secured with silk cords that wouldn't rattle. The result: a force could advance within arm's reach of sentries, their presence masked not by darkness alone, but by an almost supernatural stillness. Historical accounts describe castle guards found dead at their posts with no alarm ever raised, their throats slit by attackers who seemed to materialize from the air itself. But true mastery went beyond individual skill. Coordinating an entire unit in absolute silence required innovative communication. Hand signals replaced shouts, with complex gestures conveying everything from enemy positions to attack timing. Ninja used natural sounds, crickets chirping, owls hooting, as cover for brief whispers, and some clans developed coded taps on bamboo pipes that echoed like ordinary nighttime forest noises. During the siege of Iga province in 1581, defenders employed these techniques to move reinforcements between villages undetected, turning what should have been a straightforward conquest into a nightmare of invisible foes. The psychological toll on enemies was as devastating as any physical attack. Imagine standing watch, straining your ears for any hint of danger, only to realize too late that the danger was already inside. The ninja's greatest weapon wasn't the kunai or shuriken, it was the creeping paranoia they planted, the gnawing doubt that made every shadow suspect. Samurai diaries from the era reveal commanders who stopped sleeping altogether, fearing their own bodyguards might be disguised assassins. By the time ninja clans struck the actual blow, their victims were often half defeated by exhaustion and frayed nerves. This strategy's brilliance lay in its inversion of conventional warfare. Where large armies announced their presence with banners and drums, the silent march made strength irrelevant. A dozen well-trained infiltrators could achieve what 1,000 soldiers might not access to the enemy's heart before the first alarm was raised. Modern special forces still study these ancient techniques, proving that sometimes the most effective way to win a war isn't by being the strongest, but by being the one nobody hears coming. Few sights could disarm an enemy faster than white flags fluttering above what appeared to be a broken force laying down arms. But behind those gestures of submission often lurked one of warfare's most treacherous gambits, the fake surrender. This wasn't just deception, it was psychological judo, exploiting the moment of an opponent's greatest confidence to deliver their greatest shock. At the Battle of Derb in 1260, Lithuanian warriors performed this brutal ballet with chilling precision. Their initial feigned retreat had already drawn the Teutonic knights into a vulnerable position. Then, just as the Crusaders began dismounting to accept their surrender, weapons that had been hidden beneath cloaks flashed into the sunlight, turning a scene of victory into a slaughterhouse. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its manipulation of human nature. Victories in medieval warfare followed predictable rhythms: the clashing of arms, the breaking of lines, the pursuit of the routed. But surrender, that signaled the end of tension, the moment when discipline relaxed and guards dropped. The Lithuanians understood this intimately. They didn't just mimic submission, they staged it with theater-worthy detail. Some warriors threw down swords with exaggerated exhaustion, while others wept and embraced as if mourning their defeat. A few even cut their own cheeks to smear blood on their faces, selling the illusion of broken men. The Teutonic knights, conditioned by years of crusading to expect pagan forces to fight to the death, never considered that their enemies might weaponize capitulation itself. Timing was everything. Too early and the ruse would be transparent. Too late and the enemy might already be dispatching captives or securing weapons. The Lithuanians struck at the precise midpoint, when the knights had sheathed their swords but hadn't yet bound their prisoners. Chroniclers described the moment the trap sprang, a single war horn blast that sent surrendering warriors grabbing hidden axes from carts and daggers from boot sheaths. Knights who'd been clapping each other on the back found themselves grappling with men suddenly fighting with renewed fury. The aftermath revealed why this strategy was so potent despite its risks. A conventional defeat might cost an army a third of its forces, but a betrayal during surrender could annihilate entire commands. At Derb, the Teutonic Order lost not just soldiers but irreplaceable leadership, experienced commanders who'd lowered their guard at the worst possible moment. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical losses. Future encounters saw crusaders hesitating to accept surrenders, their trust corroded by the memory of that day. This tactic's legacy stretches far beyond medieval Europe. Hannibal used aversion against the Romans at Lake Trasimene, luring them into a valley with a retreating cavalry screen before springing the trap. Even in modern conflicts, the specter of false surrenders haunts military doctrine, proof that some weapons transcend eras, because ultimately, it wasn't swords or stratagems that made this approach so devastating. It was the realization, too late, that in war, even moments of apparent peace could be lethal illusions. There's a grim calculus to survival when your back is against the wall, one that reveals how desperation can rewrite the rules of war. Imagine standing atop a besieged city's walls, watching an enemy horde assemble for the final assault, knowing your outnumbered garrison can't hold them back. Then a terrible idea takes shape. What if the very people you're sworn to protect could become, however briefly, the shield that saves them? The use of human shields wasn't just an act of brutality. It was a chillingly effective pause button, forcing invaders to weigh victory against the political and moral cost of slaughtering innocents. During the siege of Antioch in 1098, starving crusaders dragged captured Turkish civilians onto the ramparts as Muslim forces prepared to storm the gates. The assault never came. Commanders hesitated not out of weakness, but because the optics of cutting down their own people could unravel alliances and spark rebellions back home. What made this tactic so unsettlingly effective wasn't just the physical barrier, it was the psychological quicks and it created for attackers. Medieval warfare had unwritten codes even amidst the chaos. Massacring civilians, especially those of your own faith or ethnicity, could turn a triumphant campaign into a political disaster. When the Mongols laid siege to the Khwarezmian city of Gurganj in 1221, defenders herded women and children onto the battlements, betting that even Genghis Khan's infamous ruthlessness had limits. They were wrong. The Mongols stormed anyway, but the delay bought precious days for escape tunnels to be dug, allowing the city's elite to flee. The strategy's darker brilliance lay in its adaptability. Sometimes the shields weren't captives but volunteers. During the Baltic Crusades, Lithuanian villagers would deliberately gather in fortresses knowing Teutonic knights, bound by papal decrees to avoid civilian casualties, would temper their assaults. Other times the shield was symbolic. Byzantine defenders hung religious relics from the walls, daring Muslim armies to risk divine wrath by damaging sacred objects. In Spain, Jewish communities were sometimes positioned near city gates during Reconquista battles, both sides aware that Christian knights would hesitate to fire catapults if it meant killing potential converts. Yet the tactic carried monstrous risks. When it failed, the backlash was apocalyptic. At the Siege of Mara in 1098, Frankish forces, enraged after defenders used children as shields, responded with a massacre so horrific even fellow crusaders were sickened. And therein lay the paradox. Human shields worked precisely because they exploited the enemy's remaining humanity. The moment an invading army decided nothing was off limits, the defenders had signed their own death warrant. This bleak strategy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about medieval warfare's moral gray zones. It wasn't just about survival, it was about reading your opponent's vulnerabilities, whether their fear of God, their political constraints, or their lingering shreds of mercy. And in that reading, some commanders found a perverse leverage, the power to make their enemies' strength, their numbers, their zeal, their momentum become, if only for a heartbeat, their greatest weakness. The concept of the Trojan horse didn't vanish with the fall of Troy. It evolved, adapting to the castles and walled cities of the medieval world. Picture a summer funeral procession winding its way toward a fortress gate, mourners weeping beneath heavy cloaks, a wooden coffin swaying on their shoulders. The guards, wary but respectful of the dead, allow them passage only for the corpse to spring to life with a dagger in hand as soon as the gates creak shut. This was deception refined to an art form, where the invaders weren't just hiding, they were hiding in plain sight. One of the most audacious examples unfolded during the siege of Antioch in 1098. With Crusader forces starving and desperate, a small group of knights disguised themselves as local merchants, their armor concealed beneath bundles of firewood. They waited until the dead of night, then signaled their comrades by lighting a single torch atop the walls, a flicker of betrayal that unlocked the city. But the real genius lay in the details. The merchants had spent days prior mingling in nearby villages, learning dialects and mannerisms until even native speakers couldn't detect their ruse. Barrels became another favorite vessel for subterfuge. During the Hussite Wars in 15th century Bohemia, rebels smuggled fighters into Catholic-held towns inside wine casks partially filled to mask the weight of a crouching soldier. Once inside the marketplace, the wine merchants would wait for the signal, then burst forth to overwhelm gatekeepers. The tactic worked so well that some towns banned barrel deliveries altogether, forcing defenders to rethink supply chains in ways that choked local economies. Perhaps the most chilling variation involved exploiting sacred traditions. In 1439, Albanian rebels under Skanderbeg infiltrated an Ottoman fort by posing as a Greek Orthodox burial party, complete with chanting priests and incense. The Ottomans, unwilling to provoke religious backlash, allowed the procession through only to discover too late that the coffin concealed not a body, but enough weapons to arm a dozen men. Within minutes, the fort's inner sanctum was a slaughterhouse, its gates thrown open to Skanderbeg's waiting cavalry. What made these Trojan horse tactics so devastating was their psychological double blow. First came the physical breach, the sudden chaos of enemies erupting from where none should exist. But far worse was the lingering paranoia. After a few such incidents, no delivery cart, no mourner's shawl, no trader's smile could be trusted. Garrisons began turning away legitimate supplies, starving themselves in their own fear. The Venetians took this a step further during their feud with Genoa, floating unmanned ships rigged with timed explosives into enemy harbors, turning every stray vessel into a potential time bomb. This strategy's brilliance lay in its inversion of expectations. Fortresses were designed to repel battering rams and scaling ladders, not to suspect the baker's wagon or the widow's tears. It proved that the strongest walls could be undone not by force, but by the simple, terrifying power of a lie told well enough to be believed. Even today, the lesson endures. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one outside your gates, it's the one you've already let inside. Sometimes the best soldiers were the ones who never drew breath, straw-stuffed dummies propped on horseback, branches dragged to raise dust like marching feet, lines of torches flickering where no army stood. The Phantom Army was warfare's greatest magic trick, turning empty fields into battlegrounds and handfuls of men into seeming legions. Welsh Prince Owain Glyndwr mastered this spectral warfare during his rebellion against English rule, transforming the hills of Wales into a theatre of illusions. One autumn evening in 1403, his scouts spotted a column of English knights advancing through the Vale of Gwyderig. Glyndwr didn't retreat. He staged. By dawn, the valley bristled with what appeared to be thousands of spears until the wind revealed them as saplings lashed together, their leaves mimicking glinting armor. The English, convinced they faced overwhelming odds, withdrew without drawing a sword. The genius of this tactic lay in its simplicity. Glyndwr's men would tie bundles of brush to horses' tails, sending them galloping along ridgelines to churn up dust clouds visible for miles. At night, they spaced torches at irregular intervals, mimicking the disordered campfires of a sprawling force. But the real artistry came in the details. Dummy soldiers wore real helmets that caught the light, while hidden drummers echoed their beats off valley walls to distort numbers. The English, accustomed to orderly formations, saw chaos and assumed reinforcements. Other cultures weaponized similar illusions. Bedouin warriors tied palm fronds to camels, creating false mirages of advancing troops in the desert heat. The Swiss flew banners from distant trees during alpine skirmishes, making one company look like 10. Even nature could be conscripted. Scottish Highlanders burned peat in fog to mimic cooking fires, while Byzantine defenders floated unmanned boats with lanterns to simulate nighttime patrols. What made these deceptions so potent wasn't just the initial shock, but the lingering uncertainty they planted. After encountering Glyndwr's phantom armies, English commanders hesitated at every shadow, squandering opportunities against real forces. Rumors spread that the Welsh prince commanded supernatural allies, a myth he encouraged by timing attacks with thunderstorms. The lesson was clear: in warfare, perception could be deadlier than steel. When your enemy's imagination fights for you, victory becomes a matter of stagecraft as much as strength. Patience could be deadlier than any blade when timed to an enemy's moment of maximum vulnerability. Picture the Mongols' history's most feared horsemen midway across the Sojo River in 1241, their mounts straining against the current, weapons strapped to saddles to keep them dry. This was the heartbeat of peril, the fleeting window when even the mightiest army became a chaotic, half-drowned mob. The Hungarians, watching from hidden positions, didn't just attack, they waited for the precise instant when the Mongol vanguard reached the far bank, but the rear still floundered in the shallows. Then, with a single horn blast, they unleashed hell. The delayed strike wasn't about hesitation, it was about sinking violence with physics. Rivers added layers of lethality, currents dragged at legs, wet bowstrings slackened, and formations fractured as horses panicked in deepening water. At Mohyj, Hungarian crossbowmen held their fire until the Mongols' lead units were pinned between the river and a sudden cavalry charge, while engineers upstream released makeshift barges rigged with flaming pitch to crash into the crossing center. The result was a massacre in 3 acts. Those who'd crossed were isolated and slaughtered, those midstream burned or drowned, and those still on the far bank could only watch as their comrades vanished in the chaos. But the true art lay in restraint. Launch the ambush too soon and the enemy retreats intact. Too late, and they regain cohesion on solid ground. The Hungarians exploited a universal truth of medieval warfare: transitions were lethal. Whether crossing rivers, scaling walls, or changing formations, armies were never more fragile than when shifting from one state to another. Swiss pikemen used this principle against Burgundian knights, holding their pikes level until the moment cavalry committed to the charge, too late to adjust when they saw the deadly forest of spikes. Geography dictated these moments with cruel precision. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, William Wallace didn't attack the English until half their force had crossed the narrow wooden span. When his spearmen surged forward, the bridge became a death funnel. Knights in heavy armor plunged into the fort's icy waters as their reinforcements stood helpless on the opposite shore. Similarly, Byzantine generals would let Arab armies begin crossing mountain passes before rolling boulders to seal the route, trapping the vanguard without support. The delayed strike's brilliance wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. An army that believed it had safely navigated danger would drop its guard completely, making the subsequent shock doubly devastating. After Mohi, surviving Mongols reported the horror of seeing their advance units waving victory banners one moment, then swallowed by enemy forces the next. That whiplash from relief to catastrophe broke morale as surely as swords broke bone. This strategy's legacy endures in modern special operations, where snipers call it interdicting the choke point. The tools have changed, but the principle remains. Victory often belongs not to those who strike first, but to those who strike exactly when the enemy is most powerless to respond. And sometimes that means having the discipline to watch, wait, and let your opponent's own momentum become their downfall. The most audacious defenders didn't just weather sieges, they turned them inside out. While conventional wisdom said to hunker behind walls and wait, a handful of commanders realized that siege camps were just as vulnerable as the cities they surrounded. The Knights Hospitaller, trapped in their fortress at Rhodes in 1480, faced an Ottoman force 10 times their size. Instead of rationing food and praying for relief, they did the unthinkable. They opened their own gates. Under cover of darkness, armored knights slipped into the Turkish camp not to spy or sabotage, but to burn the very siege engines meant to crush their walls. By dawn, half the Ottoman catapults were smoking ruins, and the besiegers found themselves suddenly on the defensive. This reverse siege strategy flipped the script on medieval warfare's most lopsided scenario. Large armies relied on predictable rhythms encircling a fortress, building earthworks, and waiting for starvation to do their work. But when defenders struck first, that rhythm shattered. The Hospitallers' raids weren't reckless, they were surgical. They targeted bakers' tents to spoil bread supplies, stabbed holes in water skins, and even stole back livestock that had been confiscated from local farms. Each strike forced the Ottomans to divert hundreds of troops from the siege lines to guard their own perimeter, thinning their offensive strength. Geography played a crucial role. At Crac des Chevaliers in 1271, the Hospitallers used hidden sally ports, narrow tunnels disguised as drainage ditches, to launch surprise attacks. These tunnels allowed small groups to emerge behind enemy lines, striking at supply wagons before vanishing into the landscape. The besieging Mamluks, convinced the fortress had secret allies, wasted weeks scouring the countryside for non-existent reinforcements. But the true brilliance lay in timing. Reverse sieges worked best during the vulnerable early days of a blockade, before siege towers were fully assembled or trenches dug deep. The Teutonic Knights exploited this at Marienburg in 1410, sending out raiders disguised as Polish deserters who then set fire to the besiegers' gunpowder stores. The resulting chaos gave the garrison time to repair damaged walls under cover of smoke. Psychological warfare amplified the physical damage. Nothing demoralized a besieging army faster than realizing their prey had fangs. After Welsh rebels repeatedly raided English siege camps during Owain Glyndwr's revolt, chroniclers noted soldiers sleeping in armor, fearing attacks from the very walls they were meant to be besieging. The reverse siege proved that sometimes the best defense wasn't a taller wall, it was a bolder plan. And in that boldness lay a lesson for any underdog. When trapped, don't just endure. Strike back where your enemy feels safest. Few weapons struck terror into medieval armies faster than the invisible specter of disease, a foe no sword could cleave and no armor could deflect. The fake disease strategy weaponized that primal fear, turning rumor and psychology into tools as lethal as any blade. When the defenders of Kaffa found themselves besieged by Mongol forces in the 14th century, they didn't just rely on arrows and boiling oil. They allegedly loaded their catapults with corpses festering with plague and launched them over the walls, transforming the very air into a battlefield. Whether this infamous act truly spread the Black Death westward remains debated by historians, but its chilling effectiveness lies beyond doubt because nothing could unravel discipline faster than the whisper of pestilence. The brilliance of this tactic wasn't just in its grotesque theatrics, but in its exploitation of human nature. Medieval soldiers could steel themselves against visible threats, but disease was an enemy they couldn't outfight. Commanders knew an outbreak could doom campaigns faster than any ambush. During the Siege of Reval in 1343, Teutonic knights retreated after defenders rolled barrels of plague-tainted clothing into their camp, never bothering to confirm if the linens were actually infected. The mere possibility was enough. Similarly, Byzantine garrisons would contaminate water sources upstream from enemy positions, floating animal carcasses or spoiled food to trigger panic about poisoned supplies. The goal wasn't always to sicken but to seed doubt. An army preoccupied with avoiding miasma, the bad air believed to carry illness, was an army too distracted to fight effectively. Timing amplified the terror. Disease rumors spread fastest during summer months when heat and crowded camps bred real sickness. Welsh rebels exploited this by staging mock funeral processions near English positions during heat waves, ensuring the invaders saw and smelled the evidence of contagion. The Ottomans took a subtler approach, releasing captured prisoners who casually mentioned plague in Allied cities, letting the lie spread organically through enemy ranks. By the time commanders realized the ruse, their troops were already demanding withdrawal. The psychological toll often outpaced the physical. Armies that believed they'd been exposed to plague would sometimes abandon siege engines or burn their own supplies to prevent contamination. At the Siege of Neuss in 1474, Burgundian forces incinerated their tents after a single defender's corpse was found in their latrines, convinced it carried disease. That overreaction became the turning point of the campaign. This strategy's legacy lingers in modern biological warfare protocols, but its medieval roots reveal a timeless truth. Fear of the unseen can be deadlier than any blade. Because when you're fighting not just soldiers, but their nightmares, victory doesn't always go to the strongest. It goes to those who best understand what truly terrifies the human mind. Few maneuvers could paralyze an enemy faster than the illusion of simultaneous attacks from opposite directions, a tactic that turned confusion into a weapon. The Mongols didn't just divide enemy forces. They rewrote the rules of engagement by making every commander question their own eyes. Picture a medieval army, horns blaring as scouts report two separate columns of horse archers thundering toward them, one from the northern hills, another from the southern riverbank. The urgent question wasn't just where to deploy troops, but which threat was real and which was smoke. By the time leaders realized both advances were feints, the true strike force had already slipped through the gap in their fractured defenses like a dagger between ribs. What set the dual front feint apart was its psychological precision. Most medieval commanders trained for single-threat scenarios, frontal assaults, flanking maneuvers, but this tactic exploited their blind spot for multi-directional chaos. When Subutai, Genghis Khan's legendary general, employed it during the invasion of Kievan Rus, he didn't just send decoy units, he crafted entire narratives. One Mongol detachment would raid villages along a river, leaving obvious tracks, while another staged mock campfires miles away. Russian princes, convinced they faced pincer movements, split their armies only to find both Mongol groups evaporating like mist as the main force sacked undefended cities elsewhere. The brilliance lay in asymmetry. Unlike traditional diversions that simply drew attention, dual feints created impossible choices. At the Battle of Mohai in 1241, Batu Khan's forces pretended to ford a river at two distant points, forcing the Hungarians to stretch their ranks thin. Then, under cover of darkness, Mongol engineers built a hidden pontoon bridge right between the feints, unleashing their elite cavalry at the center where resistance had been gutted. The lesson was brutal in its clarity. When you force an enemy to defend everywhere, they effectively defend nowhere. Timing elevated this from mere trickery to artistry. Coordinating feints across miles required meticulous planning, signal flags by day, lanterns by night, and scouts relaying updates with ruthless efficiency. The Mongols synchronized their ruses so perfectly that opposing commanders received conflicting reports almost simultaneously, leaving no time to verify. Swiss mercenaries later adapted the tactic during the Burgundian Wars, using alpine echoes to mimic horn calls from multiple valleys, convincing Charles the Bold his camp was surrounded by non-existent armies. But the real mastery was in the aftermath. A successful duel feint didn't just win battles, it shattered trust. Survivors would second-guess every scout's report, every dust cloud on the horizon. Some armies, like the Polish at Legnica in 1241, became so paranoid they fired arrows at their own shadows, wasting precious ammunition on phantoms. The Mongols capitalized on this paranoia, repeating variations of the feint until entire regions surrendered at the sight of a single patrol, believing it heralded an invisible host. This strategy's genius resonates in modern military doctrine, where feints and electronic deception still shape battlefields, but its roots trace back to those medieval horsemen who understood a fundamental truth: confusion is the ally of the outnumbered. When you can't overpower your enemy, outmaneuver their expectations, and watch as their own uncertainty becomes your sharpest weapon. Fire ships transformed helpless vessels into floating volcanoes, harnessing the sea itself as an ally against overwhelming odds. Picture the desperation of Constantinople in 673, its outnumbered navy trapped in the Golden Horn as the Arab fleet closed in. Then, a flicker of movement abandoned Byzantine ships drifting toward the enemy, their decks eerily empty. Just as Arab sailors shouted warnings, gouts of flame erupted from hidden compartments, fed by secret channels of Greek fire, a napalm-like concoction that burned even on water. Within minutes, the invaders' tightly packed formation became an inescapable inferno, ships colliding in panic as sails transformed into sheets of fire. The Byzantines didn't just repel the attack, they seared the tactic into naval warfare's memory for centuries. What made fire ships so devastating wasn't just the flames, it was the psychological calculus they forced upon opponents. Large fleets relied on tight formations for mutual defense, but that very cohesion became their downfall when a single blazing hulk could doom dozens. The Dutch demonstrated this brutally during their revolt against Spain in 1575, loading hellburners, ships packed with gunpowder, shrapnel, and delayed fuses among anchored Spanish vessels at Antwerp. The resulting explosions shattered windows miles inland and sent shockwaves through European naval doctrine. Suddenly, every commander had to weigh the risk of mooring too close to allies versus spreading too thin to defend. The artistry lay in the details. Effective fire ships weren't merely set alight and pushed seaward. They were carefully engineered for maximum chaos. Venetian variants used sails rigged to collapse at the last moment, ensuring the burning mass drifted deep into enemy lines before disintegrating. Chinese admirals during the Song dynasty built fire ships with collapsing decks, revealing secondary fires that ignited after the initial blaze seemed spent. But the true masters were the Byzantines, who perfected directional fire using angled rudders and weighted hulls that kept their Greek fire projectiles spraying toward targets even as the ship burned. Timing elevated this weapon from nuisance to war winner. launched too early and enemies could tow the threat aside. Too late and they'd scatter. The Spanish Armada learned this tragically in 1588 when the English sent 8 fire ships into their crescent formation at Calais. Though only 1 Spanish ship burned, the panic broke their defensive formation, allowing English warships to pick off stragglers. Like a single spark in dry grass, the psychological impact far outstripped the physical damage, a lesson the Koreans would echo during Admiral Yi Sun Sin's campaigns, where modified turtle ships towed fire ships into Japanese fleets under cover of night. The fire ship's legacy endures in modern asymmetrical warfare, from explosive-laden speedboats to drone swarms. It proved that sometimes the most formidable weapon isn't the mightiest warship, but the willingness to sacrifice assets creatively. When facing superior numbers, the Byzantines and their successors showed that victory could rise from the ashes of what others would consider lost causes, literally. The sight of an approaching army didn't just spark fear, it did math in the minds of those watching, calculating odds based on the sea of banners and spears stretching to the horizon. But what if that calculation was a deliberate lie? The shadow army strategy weaponized perception, turning farmers and shepherds into illusions of military might with nothing more than borrowed spears and clever staging. During the Swabian War of 1499, Swiss commanders faced an imperial force nearly double their size. Their solution: they dressed herdsmen in spare helmets, handed them pikes, and marched them in tight formations behind real soldiers. From a distance, the untrained peasants looked every bit as formidable as professional infantry, especially when the Swiss spaced them artfully across hillsides to amplify their numbers. What made this ruse so effective wasn't just the visual trickery, it was the timing. Shadow armies worked best when glimpsed briefly, the flicker of movement through trees, the glint of metal on a distant ridge. The Swiss enhanced the illusion by having their conscripts mimic drills they'd observed, swinging tools like weapons and moving in synchronized blocks. To enemy scouts peering from afar, the deception was flawless. By the time imperial commanders realized half the soldiers were holding hayforks instead of halberds, they'd already diverted precious troops to reinforce what they believed was the main threat, leaving their actual flanks exposed. Other cultures refined the tactic with local twists. In feudal Japan, ashigaru foot soldiers would tie leafy branches to their backs while crossing open terrain, creating the illusion of a larger force swaying like a forest in the wind. The Byzantines went further, paying nomadic tribes to ride in overlapping circles around their camps, kicking up dust clouds that suggested endless reinforcements. But perhaps the most audacious example came from the Hussite Wars, where Czech rebels draped cloaks over wooden frames propped on wagons, transforming supply trains into seemingly endless rows of archers when viewed from castle walls. The psychological impact lingered long after the ruse was revealed. An enemy who'd been fooled once became prone to overestimating forever after. Scottish clans exploited this during the Wars of Independence, using the same groups of men to appear on different hillsides throughout a single day, each time with slight changes to their attire, convincing English patrols they faced fresh regiments materializing from the heather. The lesson was clear: in warfare, perception could conscript reality into service. When you couldn't match your enemy's numbers, sometimes the next best thing was to let their own eyes do the lying for you. What's fascinating is how this ancient tactic echoes in modern deception campaigns, from inflatable tank divisions in World War II to digital armies of bot accounts today. The tools have changed, but the principle remains: when you can't be stronger, be louder, be blurrier, be everywhere and nowhere at once. Because in the end, battles are often won not by the force you have, but by the force your enemy believes you have. Rain wasn't just an inconvenience on medieval battlefields, it was a weapon waiting to be wielded. The Scots under William Wallace didn't merely endure a downpour during their assault on the English at Loudoun Hill in 1307, they weaponized the storm itself. As sheets of rain turned the terrain to mud, the English longbowmen found their bowstrings limp and useless, their arrows falling short like harmless twigs. Meanwhile, Wallace's spearmen, advancing under the deafening roar of the deluge, reached the enemy lines before sentries even spotted their shadows through the curtain of water. This wasn't luck, it was meteorological warfare, turning the sky's fury into an ally. The genius of weather gambits lay in their asymmetry. Larger armies relied on coordination, trumpet signals, flag patterns, shouted orders, all of which dissolved in howling winds or blinding snow. Smaller forces, often more familiar with local climates, could exploit these moments of sensory deprivation. The Swiss Confederates timed their alpine ambushes to coincide with sudden fog banks, their attackers materializing like wraiths just paces away from panicked Habsburg soldiers. In contrast, the Byzantines developed entire naval tactics around the Meltemi winds of the Aegean, luring enemy fleets into narrow straits just as seasonal gusts rose to capsize overloaded ships. But mastering weather required more than opportunism. It demanded an almost alchemical understanding of terrain and climate. The Welsh knew which valleys amplified rainfall into flash floods, using them to isolate English cavalry from infantry support. Mongol scouts could predict steppe blizzards down to the hour, timing raids so retreating enemies would stumble blindly into whiteouts. Even something as subtle as temperature shifts became tools. During the siege of Vienna in 1529, Ottoman sappers waited for freezing nights to dampen siege tunnels, knowing morning frost would weaken the walls for their explosives. The psychological toll was often deadlier than the weather itself. Imagine being a Burgundian knight at the Battle of Morat in 1476, trapped in mud-soaked plate armor as Swiss halberdiers advanced through a thunderstorm. Lightning flashes revealed their silhouettes in strobes, turning the charge into a nightmare of disjointed terror. Or picture Spanish tercios in the Dutch Revolt, their famed pike squares collapsing not under enemy fire, but from the collective hypothermia of standing waist-deep in flooded ditches for hours. Weather didn't just hinder, it eroded the will to fight. This strategy's legacy endures wherever battles meet the elements. From Washington crossing the Delaware under nor'easter cover to Finnish ski troops ambushing Soviet tanks during winter storms, history's greatest underdogs understood one immutable truth. When you can't control the battlefield, sometimes you can let the heavens do it for you. And in that surrender to nature's chaos lay a peculiar kind of mastery, the art of making the storm itself an extension of your strategy. Fire could be more than just a weapon. It could be a carefully set stage where the enemy wrote their own doom. The bait-and-burn strategy took the primal terror of flames and refined it into a cold, calculated trap. Picture a wooden fort standing defiant on the Russian frontier, its gates temptingly ajar, its walls seemingly undermanned. To the advancing Polish forces, it appeared ripe for the taking until the first torch touched hidden pitch-soaked timbers. Within moments, what had looked like a conquest became an inferno, the very structure transforming into a roaring furnace with the invaders trapped inside. This wasn't just arson, it was theater where the props were kindling and the script ended in ashes. The Russians perfected this grim art during their wars with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, turning their enemies' momentum against them. They understood something fundamental about siege psychology. Attackers expected resistance at the walls, not from the walls themselves. By deliberately leaving forts partially dismantled or garrisons seemingly weakened, they lured overconfident forces into wooden death traps. The genius lay in the preparation. Timber beams were pre-cut to collapse and block exits, while hidden channels of flammable oil ran beneath floorboards. Some accounts describe straw-packed tunnels beneath courtyards, ignited remotely by fuses made from slow-burning hemp rope. The goal wasn't merely to burn, it was to eliminate any path of retreat, leaving the enemy to choose between suffocation or leaping into waiting spear lines. But the strategy's true brilliance extended beyond forts. Entire fields became instruments of annihilation. During the time of troubles in the early 17th century, Russian peasants adopted a horrifying variation, planting crops as usual, then secretly lining the perimeter with hidden trenches filled with dry brush. When Polish cavalry charged through what appeared to be abandoned farmland, riders found their horses' legs entangled in suddenly revealed pits, just as arrows tipped with burning rags arced overhead. The resulting wildfires didn't just kill, they demoralized, transforming the landscape itself into an active adversary. The psychological toll was as devastating as the flames. Survivors of these traps spread stories of earth that breathed fire, of buildings that ate men. Polish commanders grew hesitant to occupy even clearly undefended structures, their troops eyeing every wooden beam with suspicion. This paranoia became its own victory, delaying advances, wasting time on unnecessary inspections, and sometimes avoiding usable fortifications altogether. The Russians had weaponized not just fire, but the fear of what might be waiting where the smoke cleared. What's chilling is how this ancient tactic foreshadowed modern warfare. The scorched earth policies of later centuries shared its DNA, as did the firebombing campaigns of World War II. But the medieval version carried an intimacy that industrialized war lost the hands-on artistry of turning wood and oil into a trap that felt almost personal. Because when you couldn't match your enemy's numbers or steel, sometimes the most equalizing force wasn't a blade or a bow, but the oldest weapon humanity ever mastered: controlled, cunning destruction. Words could cut deeper than swords when aimed at the fractures in an enemy's unity. The Ottomans didn't just surround Crusader camps, they infiltrated their trust, planting seeds of doubt that grew into mutiny without a single drawn blade. During the siege of Nicopolis in 1396, they exploited a simple truth: alliances of convenience were fragile, and fear spread faster than any plague. Disguised merchants slipped into enemy lines, carrying not goods but gossip whispers that the French knights planned to abandon their Hungarian allies, or that German commanders were hoarding supplies. Within days, the camp buzzed with paranoia, fingers pointing across faction lines as rations dwindled. The Ottomans sat back and watched as their enemies turned on each other, their unity unraveling like frayed rope. The genius of whisper campaigns lay in their surgical precision. Unlike broad propaganda, these rumors were tailored to exploit existing tensions. The Byzantines mastered this art centuries earlier, forging letters between Arab generals that suggested betrayal, sparking purges within their own ranks. But the Ottomans added a cruel twist. They let the lies evolve organically. A single planted rumor about delayed pay would mutate into tales of stolen treasure, then escalate into accusations of outright treason. By the time commanders tried to quell the unrest, the damage was irreversible. At Varna in 1444, a forged order supposedly from the papal legate convinced Hungarian nobles to charge prematurely, straight into a slaughter the Ottomans had prepared for. Timing was everything. These campaigns hit hardest during sieges where stress and boredom amplified suspicion. The Teutonic Knights learned this too well during their Baltic campaigns, when Lithuanian defenders spread stories of secret peace talks between the order and rival factions. Knights who'd fought side by side for years suddenly barred their doors at night, distrusting their own brethren. Some whisperers didn't even need words, just actions designed to be misinterpreted. The Mamluks would release captured mercenaries with conspicuously full purses, ensuring their former employers assumed the worst. The psychological toll was exponential. An army that stopped trusting its leaders became a collection of armed strangers, each soldier eyeing the next as a potential traitor. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, defenders admitted the Turkish whispers had been deadlier than their cannon, sapping morale until the final assault felt inevitable. This strategy's chilling legacy endures in modern information warfare, proving that the most devastating sieges aren't always against walls, but against the minds behind them. Because when you can't break an enemy's lines, sometimes the next best option is to let them break themselves. Some reputations were deadlier than the sharpest blade, not because they promised victory, but because they erased any hope of an easy fight. The Swiss didn't just win battles, they cultivated an aura so fearsome that enemies sometimes surrendered before the first clash. Their secret wasn't supernatural skill or overwhelming numbers. It was the unshakable certainty that every Swiss fighter would rather die on his feet than yield an inch. This wasn't mere bravery, it was psychological warfare distilled to its purest form. By the 15th century, the mere sight of their pike squares advancing in eerie silence could splinter opposing formations before a single blow was struck. The legend grew from bloody fact. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, a handful of Swiss peasants ambushed a Habsburg army in a mountain pass, hurling boulders and logs before charging with farm tools turned weapons. Not one surrendered even when surrounded. Decades later at Nancy, their rearguard fought to the last man against Burgundian knights, buying time for their comrades to regroup. These weren't isolated acts of heroism, they were policy. Swiss mercenary contracts famously lacked surrender clauses, and their commanders routinely burned bridges behind them before battle, eliminating retreat as an option. Word spread, fighting the Swiss meant accepting extermination-level casualties, even in victory. What made this reputation so potent was its self-fulfilling nature. The more enemies believed it, the more it shaped their actions. At the Siege of Dornach in 1499, an imperial force outnumbering the Swiss garrison 5-1 inexplicably withdrew after a single skirmish. Chroniclers noted their commander's terror at facing men who laugh at death. Even the vaunted Landsknechts, Europe's other elite mercenaries, demanded triple pay to engage them. The Swiss didn't need to win every battle, they just needed their foes to calculate whether any victory was worth the cost. Other cultures weaponized similar legends. The Spartans at Thermopylae understood this centuries earlier. Their three-day stand against Persia's millions became a deterrent that outlived their city-state. The Gurkhas later harnessed the same principle, their kukri-wielding ferocity making entire regiments hesitate, but the Swiss distinction lay in institutionalizing it. Their armies moved with deliberate slowness, never rushing to battle but always advancing inexorably, their very pace signaling inevitability. The lesson transcends medieval battlefields. Deterrence isn't about strength alone. It's about convincing your opponent that engaging you will extract a price too terrible to bear. Whether in boardrooms or battle lines, some fights are won not by superior force, but by making the other side question whether winning is worth the scars. The Swiss didn't just carry weapons, they carried a story, and sometimes the right story can be the heaviest armor of all. Legacy isn't just about what's remembered, it's about what lingers unseen in the DNA of warfare, long after the swords are sheathed and the castles crumble. Those medieval commanders who turned forests into fortresses and rumors into weapons weren't just solving immediate problems, they were writing a playbook that would outlast empires. Fast forward to the jungles of Vietnam, where the Viet Cong dug tunnels eerily reminiscent of the Welsh pits of despair, or to the mountains of Afghanistan, where Mujahideen fighters mirrored Swiss ambush tactics with modern rifles instead of halberds. The tools changed, but the principles remained timeless. When you lack numbers, you must leverage cunning, terrain, and the enemy's own assumptions against them. Modern special forces owe more to these medieval innovators than they might realize. Take the Navy SEALs' emphasis on relative superiority, the idea that small units can dominate larger forces by controlling the pace and place of engagement. It's the same logic William Wallace employed at Stirling Bridge, compressing the battlefield until the English advantage became a liability. Or consider the Israeli Defense Forces' use of maskirovka, deception campaigns that borrow directly from Byzantine false intelligence tactics, right down to staged radio chatter mimicking their medieval predecessors' forged letters. Even drone warfare echoes the Venetian fire ship's sacrificial, remote-controlled weapons designed to sow chaos in enemy ranks. The psychological threads run deeper still. Medieval commanders understood what modern psychologists now quantify. Fear disrupts decision-making more reliably than bullets. The SAS is nighttime raids in desert storms designed to disorient and terrify, are spiritual successors to the Norse howls and Swiss Kurehan horns. And when Ukrainian forces today use social media to spread misinformation about Russian troop movements, they're employing the same whisper campaigns the Ottomans perfected outside Nicopolis, weaponizing uncertainty to fracture cohesion. What's remarkable isn't just the persistence of these strategies, but their democratization. Medieval tactics were born of necessity among the outgunned and outnumbered. Today, they're studied by insurgents and superpowers alike. The Mongols' feigned retreats find new life in cyber warfare, where hackers lure security teams into chasing decoy data while the real breach occurs elsewhere. Scorched Earth has evolved into digital equivalence ransomware that doesn't just encrypt data but destroys backup systems, mirroring the destruction of crops and wells. Yet the most enduring lesson isn't technical, it's philosophical. These strategies remind us that innovation thrives under constraint, that the underdog's greatest advantage has always been the ability to rewrite the rules. When a Swiss pike square held firm against charging knights, or a Lithuanian fake surrender turned the tables at Derb, they proved a universal truth. Victory often belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those who best understand how to disrupt, deceive, and endure. That legacy doesn't just belong to history, it's etched into the DNA of every guerrilla fighter, every special operator, and every defiant spirit who's ever stared down impossible odds and decided to outthink them instead. The annals of medieval warfare aren't just dusty records of forgotten battles, they're masterclasses in human creativity under pressure. These 28 strategies we've explored together reveal something far more profound than clever tricks. They show how constraints can birth brilliance. Every time a smaller force outmaneuvered a giant, every instance where deception triumphed over steel, they weren't just winning battles, they were proving that the mind is the ultimate weapon. What's remarkable isn't just the variety of tactics, but how they all share a common thread: the refusal to play by the invaders' rules. When the Mongols feigned retreat, when the Swiss turned mountains into fortresses, when the Byzantines weaponized misinformation, they were all doing the same thing, rewriting the script. They understood that conventional warfare favors the strong, so they made the conflict unconventional. A forest wasn't just terrain, it was an ally. Silence wasn't just absence, it was a cloak. Even surrender could be a blade in disguise. These lessons echo far beyond medieval battlefields. Modern startups use guerrilla marketing tactics straight from the Welsh playbook. Cybersecurity experts build digital choke points that would make Swiss commanders nod in approval. And when underdog sports teams study opponents' habits to exploit weaknesses, They're channeling the same spirit as those Lithuanian warriors who faked capitulation at Derb. The core truth remains: advantage isn't given, it's engineered. Which of these strategies resonated most? Was it the psychological mastery of the Phantom Army, or the brutal efficiency of Scorched Earth? Perhaps the night raids that turned darkness into a weapon, or the whispered campaigns that made paranoia do the work of an army. That's the beauty of history. It doesn't just tell us what happened, it asks us to imagine ourselves in those moments. Could we have been as resourceful, as fearless as we close this chapter? Remember that these aren't just stories. They're invitations to rethink our own battles, whether personal, professional, or creative. Because while we may not face invading armies today, we all encounter moments where the odds seem impossible. And in those moments, the past whispers a reminder: size is never the final word. Strategy is, now it's your turn. Which of these ancient tactics left you in awe? Drop your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this journey through history's most ingenious underdogs, hit subscribe so you won't miss our next deep dive. After all, the best lessons from the past are the ones we carry forward.